Pelican Bay State Prison, California's most secretive fortress of control. Behind its steel walls lies a world engineered not just to confine, but to reshape human behavior itself. Here, every light, door, and inch of concrete was designed to break the will of men. But who built this machine of silence? And why? Today we expose the architects behind America's most psychologically engineered prison. The ones who decided exactly how much freedom a human mind could endure before it cracked. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This story is just one of many deep dives into the hidden world of American prisons. When Pelican Bay State Prison opened its gates in 1989, it wasn't just another correctional facility, it was a scientific experiment in total control. Built on 275 acres of remote redwood forest in Crescent City, California, the prison was isolated by design. The architects, a team under the California Department of Corrections (CDC), and state-hired engineers, studied not just blueprints, but human psychology. They wanted to build a place where inmates couldn't riot, organize, or even speak to each other without permission. Their inspiration came from the Supermax Revolution, a new philosophy of incarceration that began spreading in the 1980s, after waves of prison violence and overcrowding across the U.S. The CDC commissioned an architecture firm to design a compound that would eliminate human contact. Every hallway was laid out in a way that removed line of sight between prisoners. Cells were angled so that no inmate could make eye contact with another through the tiny door slots. The architects even studied airflow patterns, how voices and sounds could travel through vents, and designed them to prevent communication between cells. Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, SHU, became the prototype for modern psychological isolation. The SHU alone was a 14-acre structure with 1,056 cells, each measuring 8 by 10 feet. Inside there were no windows, no bars, and no sky. Just solid gray concrete. The only light came from a fluorescent tube that never turned off. Prison staff called it control by architecture. The walls did the work of the guards. Every surface, every sound, every beam of light was part of a behavioral algorithm. An invisible hand that dictated when a man could move, sleep, or think. Even the exercise yards were designed to reinforce that control. Known among inmates as dog runs, they were small concrete enclosures, about the size of a garage, with 20-foot-high walls and a narrow grate above for sunlight. There was no view of the outside world. A man could spend years here without seeing a tree, a bird, or another person's full face. According to California's Department of Corrections blueprints, Pelican Bay's SHU was divided into pods of 8 cells each. Each pod had an electronically controlled door system that allowed guards to release one prisoner at a time, minimizing human interaction to nearly zero. For the architects, this was efficiency. For inmates, it became psychological warfare. The men who would later testify about their time inside described Pelican Bay not as a prison, but as a laboratory. They were the subjects in an experiment on isolation, one that, according to lawsuits and psychiatric evaluations, drove many to the brink of madness. Court documents from the Madrid versus Gomez case in 1995 revealed internal memos showing that prison designers had modeled parts of Pelican Bay after behavioral control facilities used in military and psychiatric institutions. Their goal was to create a self-regulating environment. The building itself was supposed to enforce obedience. Inside the SHU, silence was constant. Guards communicated through intercoms and automated doors. Meals slid through a narrow food port. Medical checks were done through glass. Even visits from family took place through a video screen. There was no handshake, no hug, just reflection through glass. Psychologists later testified that long-term SHU confinement caused severe psychiatric breakdowns indistinguishable from psychosis. Yet, to prison administrators, that was proof of success. It meant the environment had stripped away defiance. The architects of inmate control had achieved what no warden or riot squad could, a prison where rebellion died quietly. One of the lead designers, identified in later interviews as a state-hired planner named James Park, described his philosophy bluntly. You don't rehabilitate violent men by giving them comfort. You break them down to rebuild them. His statement would become the unofficial motto of Pelican Bay's SHU program. But the blueprint of control extended beyond architecture. It was also social engineering. Prison officials implemented a system known as debriefing. Inmates suspected of gang involvement could only leave the SHU by informing on their peers. It turned men into informants, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. The architects of this policy understood that isolation alone wasn't enough. they needed to fracture loyalty. By the mid-1990s, over 1,000 men lived in complete isolation inside Pelican Bay's SHU. Many spent more than a decade there. Some never left alive. And as the years passed, the question began to emerge. Who were these architects, these unseen engineers of obedience, and what gave them the authority to decide how much silence a man could survive? The answers would soon unfold through courtrooms, investigations, and the stories of those who lived and died inside the gray labyrinth they built. By the early 1990s, whispers about Pelican Bay's control unit had reached the outside world. Human rights attorneys, psychiatrists, and former guards began describing what was happening inside the SHU as a mass psychological experiment, one without consent, oversight, or ethical boundaries. What was meant to be a place for the worst of the worst had quietly become a test lab for human endurance. The architects had built a machine to suppress rebellion, but no one asked what that machine did to the mind. The first cracks in the silence. In 1993, an internal memo leaked from within the California Department of Corrections. It referred to controlled environmental response testing, coded language for behavioral observation under isolation. According to later court filings, Pelican Bay's management was tracking how inmates reacted to months, even years of solitary confinement. The results were grim. Self-mutilation, suicide attempts, and psychotic breakdowns increased sharply after just 6 months in the SHU. But rather than interpret that as failure, administrators saw it as data. In their view, these reactions validated the effectiveness of environmental control. As one retired warden would later testify in Madrid versus Gomez, 1995. Pelican Bay was the most behaviorally controlled facility we'd ever built. The architecture worked exactly as intended. That intention was what disturbed human rights lawyers most. The lawsuit that exposed the system. In 1993, the Prison Law Office and the ACLU filed a groundbreaking federal lawsuit, Madrid versus Gomez. The plaintiffs, hundreds of inmates from the SHU, accused the state of cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. For the first time, the public heard what life in Pelican Bay's SHU actually looked like. Inmate testimony described round-the-clock fluorescent lights, no human contact, meals through slots, and yard time in a windowless cage. One inmate in court documents said, "The only voices I hear are the ones in my head. I haven't touched another person in 7 years." The court summoned experts in psychiatry and architecture. Their findings shocked the nation. According to Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist specializing in isolation effects, the SHU's design produced a distinct psychiatric syndrome, a predictable pattern of hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional breakdowns. He concluded, "This environment was not designed to rehabilitate. It was designed to extinguish the self." Judge Thelton Henderson's final ruling in 1995 confirmed what activists had long suspected. Pelican Bay's SHU inflicts cruel and unusual punishment on mentally ill prisoners. The court ordered immediate reforms, but it stopped short of dismantling the architecture of control itself. The physical design remained intact. The walls, lighting, and isolation pods, those stayed. The architect's blueprint had become too influential to destroy. The secret influence behind Supermax design. Pelican Bay didn't exist in isolation. Around the same time, the Federal Bureau of Prisons began building ADX Florence in Colorado, a national version of Pelican Bay's SHU model. Documents later revealed that several Pelican Bay planners had advised on ADX's design. The architects of control had exported their blueprint to the entire nation. Pelican Bay was their prototype. ADX Florence became their masterpiece. Both prisons used the same core principles. Total sensory deprivation, no windows, minimal color, artificial light. Technological control, doors, lights, and even toilets controlled remotely. Automated isolation, movement without human guards. Acoustic suppression, walls and vents built to absorb sound. This was the new face of incarceration. Prisons designed like machines, not buildings. But while the architects claimed they were preventing violence, the real numbers told a different story. Reports from California's own Inspector General showed that suicide rates in the SHU were 8 times higher than in general population units. Even correctional officers admitted that prolonged isolation was breaking people. One former guard, speaking anonymously to the Los Angeles Times, said, "They built a place that controls inmates so well, it controls us too. You stop feeling human after a while." Psychological warfare by design. Every inch of Pelican Bay's SHU reflected a cold understanding of psychology. The constant fluorescent light disoriented sleep cycles. The lack of natural sound, no wind, no birds, no human voices, disrupted sensory balance. Prisoners described hearing their own heartbeat echo through the walls. Guards, observing from control booths, referred to it as induced calm. But the calm was a lie. The human mind, deprived of stimulation, begins to devour itself. Prison psychiatrists documented inmates talking to insects, screaming into toilets to hear an echo, or pacing figure eights for hours. Still, the system persisted. The architects of inmate control had proven that architecture could replace authority, that walls could do what batons could not. The ethical question. By the late 1990s, journalists and human rights investigators began asking the question no one inside the system wanted to confront. Who are these architects, and what right did they have to design human suffering? Their names were buried in state contracts. Engineers, designers, and consultants who worked for the California Department of Corrections Facilities Design Unit. Many had backgrounds in military security and behavioral science. Some came from the private sector. Companies that later helped design supermaxes in Illinois, Virginia, and Arizona. None faced scrutiny. They called themselves security planners, not psychologists. But their blueprints became the physical embodiment of psychological warfare, designed not to reform but to control. The line between architecture and ethics blurred at Pelican Bay. The men who drew those plans never saw the screams, the breakdowns, the suicides. To them it was just concrete and data. Yet for those inside, it became a living tomb. By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay had become more than a prison. It was a system that ran itself. The architects of inmate control had achieved what they'd envisioned from the start. A closed-loop environment where human behavior was monitored, corrected, and subdued with almost no human interaction. To outside observers, it was a marvel of efficiency. To those inside, it was a nightmare without end. The birth of the automated prison. In most prisons, the clang of keys and the shuffle of boots marked the passage of time. At Pelican Bay, the rhythm was mechanical. The low hum of ventilation ducts, the hiss of hydraulics, the distant click of automated steel doors. Guards no longer needed to walk the tiers. Instead, they sat behind thick glass in control booths, operating the unit through joystick-like panels. One movement opened a door, released an inmate, or activated a light. They could see everything through surveillance monitors, yet remain unseen themselves. Every pod had motion sensors and microphones. Every conversation, every knock, every echo was potentially recorded. This was deliberate. According to state engineering documents later reviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle, Pelican Bay's SHU was one of the first prisons to implement behavioral monitoring through environmental control. Even minor movements were logged to study patterns of compliance. It wasn't just architecture anymore, it was data-driven obedience. One inmate, interviewed by Human Rights Watch in 2001, described it this way. You learn fast. When you move too slow, they log it. When you move too quick, they log that too. You start acting like the building wants you to act. That was exactly the point. The architects didn't just build walls, they built a feedback system that turned prisoners into predictable variables. The guards behind the glass. For the correctional officers, the system offered safety, but at a cost. Over time, even the staff began to feel the psychological weight of isolation. A former Pelican Bay guard, speaking under anonymity to PBS Frontline, explained, "We weren't allowed to talk much. You sit in a booth all day watching men on screens pressing buttons. You stop thinking of them as people. Eventually, you stop feeling like one yourself." The control booths were small, windowless, and soundproof. Officers spent 8 to 10 hours surrounded by silence and screens, monitoring pods where no one spoke. Several later reported symptoms similar to the inmates: insomnia, anxiety, and emotional numbness. The system was doing to its operators what it did to its subjects. Control, it seemed, was contagious. The silent resistance. But even in total isolation, the human instinct to connect never dies. Inside Pelican Bay, inmates developed ingenious methods to defy the machine. They created a tap code system, rhythmic knocks on walls and plumbing lines that transmitted letters of the alphabet. A slow, patient language that carried messages through concrete. They used mirrors or reflective metal fragments to communicate across corridors when guards weren't watching. One SHU inmate told Mother Jones magazine, "They think they built silence, but silence speaks if you know how to listen." These were not just acts of defiance, they were survival. Men who hadn't seen another human face in years found ways to remind themselves that they weren't alone. They shared news, legal advice, and hope, one tap, one echo, one vibration at a time. In 2011, that quiet resistance erupted into something bigger. The hunger strike that shook Pelican Bay. On July 1, 2011, hundreds of SHU inmates across Pelican Bay refused their meals. Their demands were simple but powerful. End indefinite solitary confinement. Stop the debriefing policy that forced prisoners to inform. Provide basic human contact and rehabilitation. The hunger strike spread like wildfire, first through California's prisons then across the country. Within 2 weeks, over 6,000 inmates had joined. What terrified officials wasn't the number, it was how the message spread. There were no phones, no internet, no letters. Yet word of the protest moved through the walls, plumbing, and rumor networks faster than anyone imagined possible. The same architecture built to suppress communication had become the conduit for rebellion. In an ironic twist, the architect's perfect system had turned against itself. State officials were forced to negotiate. Though they initially denied wrongdoing, mounting public pressure and media coverage forced change. Some policies were softened and small reforms were made, but the SHU structure itself remained largely intact. Still, the hunger strike marked a turning point. The myth of total control had been broken. Technology tightens the grip. By 2013, the California Department of Corrections introduced a new layer of surveillance: digital monitoring systems. Cameras replaced more guards, and inmate files were digitized for predictive behavior analysis. According to a 2014 investigative report by the Marshall Project, Pelican Bay began experimenting with risk-based confinement models, using algorithmic predictions to decide who stayed in isolation. A computer, not a warden, now determined a man's future. This raised new ethical alarms. Lawyers warned that such systems replicated bias and stripped prisoners of due process. But inside Pelican Bay, ethics had long been a distant concept. The architects of control were still at work. Only now their tools were software and sensors instead of concrete and steel. The human cost. By 2015, more than 500 inmates had been in Pelican Bay's SHU for over a decade. Some for more than 20 years. Their minds bore the scars of the system's design. One man scratched an entire Bible onto his wall using a paper clip. Another claimed he could feel the building breathe with him. Dozens attempted suicide after prolonged isolation. Prison psychologists reported what they called structural PTSD, trauma caused not by violence but by the architecture itself. The architects had succeeded beyond their intentions. They built a structure so powerful it reshaped human consciousness. The turning tide. In 2015, a landmark settlement in Ashker versus Governor of California forced major reforms. The state agreed to limit long-term solitary confinement and transfer hundreds of inmates out of the SHU. For the first time in decades, Pelican Bay's control unit began to empty. The silence was breaking. But even as the cells opened, the legacy of control remained. The blueprints that started in Crescent City had already spread to prisons in Illinois, Virginia, Colorado, and beyond. The machine had replicated itself. Every great system of control has its designers, men who operate in the shadows, crafting structures that outlive their names. Pelican Bay's architects were no different. They weren't wardens or guards but engineers, bureaucrats, and consultants, professionals who saw control not as cruelty, but as design efficiency. Their mission: to create a prison that could discipline without force, punish without violence, and manage thousands of men through architecture alone. And they succeeded. But the question remains, who were they and what drove them to build silence itself? The bureaucrats behind the blueprint. In 1985, California's Department of Corrections, CDC, formed a specialized division, the Facilities Planning and Construction Branch. Its goal was to design the next generation of secure environments. At the center of that group was James E. Park, a state-hired planner with a background in environmental design and behavior studies. Park had never worked in a prison before. But he understood one thing better than anyone: how the built environment shapes human psychology. Park collaborated with Daniel Vasquez, a retired warden from San Quentin who was brought in as an operational advisor. Together, they toured isolation units across the country, including Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois, which had pioneered the idea of long-term lockdowns after a deadly 1983 riot. Their conclusion: control through confinement was effective, but control through design could be absolute. According to internal CDC memos later cited in Madrid versus Gomez, Park's team proposed a no-contact facility, where the building itself enforces discipline. The project was approved by the California State Legislature in 1986, with a $277 million budget. The result was Pelican Bay State Prison, a monument to environmental control hidden deep in the redwoods near the Oregon border. The private sector's shadow role. While Park's team led the planning, much of the execution came from private firms. One of the key players was Helmuth, Obata plus Kassabaum HOK, a global architecture firm known for designing courthouses and secure facilities. Their consultants worked under the CDC to develop the SHU's unique pod design. 8 cells per unit, 1 control booth, and 0 visibility between inmates. According to Architectural Record Archives from 1990, HOK's involvement in Pelican Bay later influenced multiple Supermax projects, including ADX Florence in Colorado and TAMS Correctional Center in Illinois. Though the company distanced itself from operational ethics, former designers later admitted that Pelican Bay marked a turning point in carceral architecture. One of them told The Atlantic in a 2007 interview, "We were told to make escape impossible, contact minimal, and oversight easy. We didn't ask what it would do to a man's mind. Their task was technical, but their legacy became psychological." The military connection. Digging deeper reveals a more unsettling link. Several consultants involved in Pelican Bay's design had previously worked on military correctional facilities and intelligence infrastructure. In particular, project correspondence obtained through California's Public Records Act connected some of the early design advisors to U.S. Navy security contracts. These consultants introduced the concept of sensory regulation, using architecture to manipulate awareness and compliance. Their techniques had been used in classified military sites, where psychological control was essential to discipline. At Pelican Bay, those methods were adapted for civilians. The use of sealed concrete chambers, light uniformity, and acoustic suppression all stemmed from research into interrogation environments, conditions that disorient the mind by eliminating external reference points. One federal report in 1994, later declassified, noted the eerie similarity between Pelican Bay's SHU and environmental control rooms designed for national security purposes. Whether intentional or coincidental, the overlap was undeniable. The architects of inmate control had borrowed from the language of military psychology. The silence business. By the late 1990s, control architecture had become a lucrative export. Private companies began selling Supermax design packages to states across America, modular systems modeled directly after Pelican Bay's blueprint. Each promised maximum security with minimum staff. The numbers were irresistible to state governments. Lower staff-to-inmate ratios. Reduced risk of riots. Minimal lawsuits from direct guard inmate violence. But the cost wasn't in dollars, it was in humanity. Reports by the American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU) and Amnesty International revealed that more than 40 states had adopted Pelican Bay-style isolation units by 2005. The California model had gone national, spreading through prisons like a silent virus. When asked in a 2006 state hearing whether he had any regrets, one of the original Pelican Bay planners replied, "No. We built exactly what we were asked to build, a facility that maintained order." He paused, then added, "What they did with it, that wasn't up to us. But in truth it was. The architects knew exactly what they were designing, not just walls but a system of psychological conditioning." The ethical reckoning. By 2013, investigative journalists began identifying and questioning the individuals responsible. Some, like James Park, had retired quietly. Others, now consultants, were designing new correctional campuses with similar philosophies, only this time under softer names like behavioral management units or step-down facilities. When asked whether he believed Pelican Bay crossed ethical lines, Park defended his work. "We didn't build torture chambers. We built order. The moral question isn't ours to answer, it's society's." But society did begin to answer. In 2015, Ashker versus Governor of California finally forced the state to limit long-term solitary confinement. The architect's system had been exposed for what it was, a machine for breaking human beings. Still, no designer, planner, or consultant faced accountability. Their blueprints remain in use. Their methods are taught in criminal justice architecture programs across the country. And their work continues to influence prison design abroad, from the UK's closed supervision centres to Australia's high-risk management units. The architects of inmate control had built more than a prison, they had built a philosophy. A belief that behavior can be engineered, that silence can be managed, that obedience can be drawn in concrete. The hidden legacy. Today, if you visit Pelican Bay, it looks almost peaceful. The grey walls fade into the mist. The razor wire glints under the coastal fog. To an untrained eye, It's just another correctional facility. But beneath that calm lies an invisible network of design, a structure calibrated to suppress the human spirit. Every corridor, every angle, every acoustic panel still whispers the same message the architects encoded decades ago. You are not in control. And even though reforms have softened the program, thousands of men across America still live in rooms modeled after Pelican Bay, rooms where silence is the loudest sound in the world. When the steel doors of Pelican Bay's SHU finally opened for hundreds of men after the 2015 reforms, they didn't step into freedom. They stepped into confusion. For many, the outside world was louder, brighter, and more unpredictable than they could bear. The human brain, after years of confinement and silence, doesn't simply return to normal. Pelican Bay was built to break patterns of defiance, but what it broke most efficiently were minds. The aftermath of isolation. In the years following Ashker versus Governor of California, mental health experts began studying the long-term psychological damage inflicted on former SHU inmates. What they found was chilling. A 2016 study by the University of California, Santa Cruz, in collaboration with human rights attorneys, documented that over 80% of men released from Pelican Bay's SHU exhibited severe post-traumatic symptoms: insomnia, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and auditory hallucinations. Dr. Craig Haney, a leading psychologist who testified in Madrid versus Gomez 2 decades earlier, revisited several of his former subjects. His findings were stark. These men had adapted to survive in an environment where survival required emotional death. When you take them out, the body leaves the cell but the mind stays behind. Many described feeling unsafe in open spaces. Crowds triggered panic. Simple human touch, a handshake, a hug, felt unbearable. One former inmate, identified in interviews only as Marcus, said, "After 14 years in the SHU, I couldn't look people in the eye. The world was too bright, too fast. I still sleep with the lights on because darkness means the door's about to open." For Marcus and hundreds like him, Pelican Bay's walls became psychological scars etched deep within memory. The brain under siege. Neuroscientists later confirmed what inmates had long described. Isolation doesn't just damage emotions, it rewires the brain. A 2017 study published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience showed that prolonged sensory deprivation reduces activity in the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory and spatial awareness, and increases stress hormone levels. In layman's terms, solitary confinement physically shrinks the part of the brain that makes you human. MRI scans from subjects who had experienced long-term isolation revealed patterns similar to those found in individuals with complex PTSD or traumatic brain injury. Dr. Stuart Gracian, who had warned about this decades earlier, wrote, "These prisons are not just punishing behavior, they are altering the brain's biology. The result is a kind of manufactured mental illness." Pelican Bay was designed to control bodies. It ended up reshaping minds. The echo of silence. Even after leaving Pelican Bay, many men reported hearing the sound. A faint hum. A phantom vibration. The noise of the ventilation system that never stopped inside the SHU, still echoing in their ears years later. Psychologists called it residual auditory imprinting, a byproduct of prolonged exposure to mechanical monotony. But for the men, it was more than a symptom. It was a reminder. A former inmate named Richard Johnson, who spent 11 years in the SHU, told the Los Angeles Times, "It's like the prison is still running inside my head. I hear that hum in my sleep. When I wake up, I still look for the slot where the food tray comes in." Even freedom for them came with an invisible cage. The struggle to reintegrate. For most ex-SHU prisoners, reentry programs were nearly non-existent. The system that had invested millions in controlling them offered almost nothing to help them rejoin society. Released men struggled with basic interactions: grocery stores, public transportation, even sunlight. Many became reclusive, unable to hold jobs or relationships. Some ended up homeless or reincarcerated within months. In 2018, a report by the Center for Constitutional Rights found that former Pelican Bay inmates had a suicide rate nearly 5 times higher than the state average for parolees. The environment had stripped them of social reflexes. Their coping mechanisms, isolation, silence, hypervigilance, worked in the SHU but failed in the outside world. A social worker who worked with ex-inmates summarized it grimly: "Pelican Bay doesn't release people. It exports trauma." The case of Todd Ashker. Perhaps the most famous name to emerge from Pelican Bay's history is Todd Ashker, the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit that finally forced reform. Ashker spent over 24 years in solitary confinement before being released into the general population in 2015. His story became a symbol of endurance, and of what it costs to survive the SHU. He described spending years teaching himself law through letters and court documents, writing motions by hand on a metal bunk under constant fluorescent light. In a rare 2016 interview, Ashker said, "You learn to control your mind because if you lose that, you're gone. They can't break your body, so they try to break your sense of time, your sense of self. You become your own company, your own world." Even after his release, Ashker's behavior reflected the deep marks of confinement. He kept his living space sparse, avoided crowds and maintained rigid routines. "Freedom," he said, "is still a room with rules." His resilience inspired others to fight, but his life also proved that Pelican Bay's control system had effects that never fully fade. The generational impact. The psychological fallout didn't stop with those who lived through the SHU, it extended to their families. Children of isolated inmates grew up without physical contact, communicating only through glass or recorded messages. Many later reported emotional detachment or mistrust of institutions. Wives and mothers described a constant state of mourning, their loved ones alive, yet unreachable. Sociologists called it intergenerational isolation. Pelican Bay's control unit wasn't just reshaping prisoners, it was reshaping families, communities, and the very definition of justice. The experts' warning. By 2020, international human rights bodies, including the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, had officially classified long-term solitary confinement, like that practiced at Pelican Bay, as a form of psychological torture. The UN's report specifically cited Pelican Bay as a case study in systemic cruelty by design. Despite reforms, the influence of its architecture remained widespread. Across the United States, thousands still lived in similar units, some renamed administrative segregation or restrictive housing, but built from the same blueprint. Dr. Haney summarized it best. Pelican Bay may change its policies, but its shadow stretches far. The architecture of isolation is now built into America's penal DNA. A prison that never ends. Decades later, the story of Pelican Bay still lingers not just in court records, but in the minds of those who survived it. For them, there's no true release. The silence follows. The light never goes off. The door never truly opens. As one ex-inmate wrote in a letter to a journalist, "They say Pelican Bay was designed to control us. But what they really built was a place that teaches you how to live with ghosts, the ghosts of yourself." Pelican Bay was never just a prison, it was a philosophy poured into concrete. Its architects proved that power doesn't always need bars, guards, or guns. Sometimes, control is built quietly, into walls, into light, into air itself. Decades later, the echoes of that design still shape how the world punishes, contains, and isolates. The names change, supermax, segregation, behavioral management, but the blueprint remains. A system that replaces punishment with paralysis. For the men who lived there, the real sentence wasn't time. It was the silence. A silence that outlasted the walls, the wardens, and even the architects who drew them. The story of Pelican Bay reminds us that architecture isn't neutral. Every building teaches something. Some teach freedom. Others teach obedience. Pelican Bay taught silence, and silence, once learned, is hard to unlearn. So the next time you hear about a modern correctional facility, remember where it all began, in a gray box on California's northern edge, where control was perfected and humanity was redesigned. If you found this story revealing, hit like, share it with others, and subscribe for more deep, factual documentaries exposing the hidden systems of power inside America's prisons. Every week, we uncover the truth behind the walls, from the architects who built them to the men who survived them.